My son-in-law handed me a brochure for a senior living facility on a Sunday afternoon, right there at my own kitchen table, while my pot roast was still warm on the stove. I set down my coffee cup, looked at the glossy photos of old men playing shuffleboard, and reached for my phone. He didn't notice. He was too busy explaining the floor plans. My name is Lawrence Briggs. I'm 67 years old, a retired high school woodshop teacher from Coleridge, Indiana. I taught for 31 years at the same school where I myself had learned to make a dovetail joint at age 16. I am not a rich man. I drive a truck that has seen better decades. I buy my flannel shirts at the farm supply store, and I live in the same house I bought in 1989 for $94,000. 3 bedrooms, a detached workshop out back, and a yard that borders a creek. Nothing fancy. But it's mine, and every board in it I know by name. My son-in-law, my daughter Nessa's husband, had been eyeing that house for 2 years. His name is Gorman. He married Nessa 4 years ago in the backyard of that very house, under the oak tree I planted the year she was born. I built the arbor they stood under. I made it from white oak, with carved details along the crossbeam. It took me 11 weekends. Gorman's father tipped it getting into position and cracked one of the uprights. And Gorman laughed and said, "Don't worry about it. It's just decoration anyway." That was the first time I understood what kind of man I was dealing with. He'd started in on the house about 8 months after the wedding. Subtle at first. "Your place is so far from everything," he'd say. "Don't you get lonely out here?" Then it became more practical. My parents are renting in Decatur, and the landlord keeps raising them. This square footage is really underused for one person. Then last fall, it stopped being subtle at all. Dad, he called me that even though I'd never invited it, my folks need to land somewhere permanent before my father's knee surgery. Your house is just sitting here. Just sitting here. Like 30 years of my life was clutter waiting to be cleared. I said I'd think about it. That was my mistake. Gorman heard think about it and translated it in his mind to yes. And so, on that Sunday in February, while I was getting ready to start the dishes, he sat down across from me, spread that brochure on the table, and told me that his parents had looked at Coleridge Meadows Senior Village and thought it seemed like a nice fit, that he'd already spoken to the director, that there was an available unit on the ground floor, which was good because of my bad knee. I don't have a bad knee, but he said it anyway, that his parents could take over my mortgage payments, which had 17 months left, and maintain the property, and I would have everything I needed in a managed community environment. Managed community environment. I am a man who has spent 31 years teaching 16-year-olds not to lose their fingers. I've run a lathe, a bandsaw, a planer, and a jointer. I coached the varsity cross-country team for 9 years. I have hiked the full length of the Shawnee Hills twice. I do not require a managed environment. I looked at Gorman across my kitchen table. He had his phone out, already showing me photos of the unit. His mother had already picked which bedroom she wanted. He showed me that too. A text from her, with a little heart emoji next to the room with the window facing the garden. My garden. That I have maintained for 28 years. That I put in myself, starting with 3 raised beds and a compost pile, and that now covers a 1/4 acre and feeds half my neighbors from June through October. His mother had put a heart emoji on my garden. I picked up my phone and sent 3 text messages. Then I told Gorman I would think it over and asked if he'd like to take some pot roast home. He said sure and helped himself to about 2/3 of it. What Gorman didn't know, and what I want to explain before I tell you what happened next, is what that house actually is. Not what it looks like from the outside, what it is. The workshop behind my house is where I have spent the last 22 years teaching children for free on Saturday mornings. Not a program, not a non-profit. Just me, the shop, and whoever showed up. It started with the kid across the street, a boy named Theron whose father had left and whose mother worked doubles at the hospital and who had no idea what to do with himself on weekends. I taught him to build a birdhouse. Then he brought a friend. Then that friend brought 2 more. At some point, it just became a thing that happened, like weather. Saturday mornings, the shop door was open. Over the years, I have taught woodworking to 61 young people in that shop behind my house. Some stayed for a few months. Some came back every Saturday for 4 or 5 years. Every single one of them left, knowing how to read a tape measure, how to set a chisel, how to look at a piece of wood and understand its grain. And something else too, though I never said it out loud. They left knowing that someone had time for them, that someone thought the thing they were making was worth making. The current kids on Saturday mornings are Theron's nephew, who is 11, and a girl named Waverly, who is 13 and who can already cut a cleaner mortise than most adults I know. But the older ones, the ones who passed through that shop over 2 decades, they weren't kids anymore. Theron was 33 now, working as a structural engineer in Columbus. There was a young woman I'll call Jules who had come to me at 15 with nowhere to be after school, and who was now a contractor in her own right, running a crew of 8 in Louisville. There was a guy named Prescott who had been the most difficult 16-year-old I ever encountered, who had tested every limit I had, and who was now a marine biology researcher at Purdue. He still sent me photos of things he built in his spare time. Last year he sent me a picture of a cedar canoe he'd made, beautiful work, and said he still heard my voice every time he picked up a handplane. 61 people. Gorman had walked through my workshop exactly once, looked around, said, "Huh, nice setup," and went back inside to watch football. He didn't know about Theron, he didn't know about Jules or Prescott or any of the others. He didn't know about the Saturday mornings or what they meant or what they'd produced. He saw a workshop full of tools that could probably be sold or rented out as storage space. He saw a house that was, in his words, underused. That's the thing about people who measure worth in square footage. They can't see what's actually in the room. The morning Gorman had planned for his parents to arrive with their boxes, I was up before 6. I made a full pot of coffee, fed the dog, and stood on the back porch watching the creek. It was a Thursday in March, cold but clear. The kind of morning where the air still smells like winter, but you can feel something underneath it loosening. By 7:30, the first truck had pulled onto my road. It wasn't a moving truck. It was Theron's truck, a white F-250, with the logo of his engineering firm on the door, and he had 3 people with him. By 8 o'clock, there were 2 more vehicles parked along the road. By 8:30, there were 11. Jules had driven up from Louisville the night before and slept at a motel in town. Prescott had flown in from West Lafayette. A young man named Seamus, who had come to me at age 13 after his parents' divorce, and stayed in that workshop for 3 years, arrived in a work van with the name of his cabinet-making shop painted on the side. They came from Columbus and Louisville and Indianapolis and Fort Wayne. One of them, a woman named Dorothea, who had been 14 when she first picked up a chisel in my shop, drove 6 hours from Pittsburgh. They stood in my driveway in the cold morning air, people in their 20s and 30s, and a few in their 40s, and they drank coffee out of paper cups and caught up with each other like it was the most natural thing in the world. Because to them it was. They all knew each other from those Saturday mornings. That shop had been a gathering place for 2 decades. Many of them had taught each other things in that space, the older ones showing the younger ones, passing it down the way it had been passed to them. I walked out, and Theron, who was the first one I'd called, handed me a cup of coffee and said, "Good morning, Mr. Briggs." Nobody called me Lawrence. Always Mr. Briggs. I'd tried for years to get them to drop it, and they never did. Gorman's car pulled onto the road at 9:15. He was driving, his wife, my daughter Nessa, in the passenger seat. His parents' sedan followed behind. I watched from the porch as Gorman slowed to navigate the row of vehicles lining my road. A Jeep, a company truck, a slate-gray sedan with Illinois plates, a pickup so new it still had dealer stickers in the back window. He inched past them with the careful attention of a man who is trying to understand something that doesn't make sense. He pulled into the driveway and got out. He looked at the people standing in my yard. He looked at the vehicles. He looked at me on the porch. "What's going on?" he said. Theron walked over to him before I could answer. He is a tall man, Theron, broad in the way that people who work with their hands get. He had on a heavyweight canvas jacket with his firm's logo on the chest. He extended his hand. "Good morning," he said. "I'm Theron. I learned to build things in that workshop. You must be the son-in-law." Gorman shook his hand on reflex. "Yeah, I'm Gorman. What is all this?" "We heard you had plans for this property," Theron said. "We thought we'd come see about that." Gorman looked at me. I took a slow sip of my coffee. His parents got out of their car. His mother, a careful woman in a nice coat, looked at the crowd in the yard, and then at her husband with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of someone realizing they had made an error. His father, a quiet man who had seemed uncomfortable the entire time I'd known him, put his hands in his pockets and said nothing. My daughter Nessa got out of the car last. She looked at the people in the yard, and then she looked at me, and something happened on her face that I hadn't seen in a while. Something that looked like relief. She walked past Gorman and came up onto the porch and stood next to me. "Hi, Dad," she said. "Hi, baby," I said. We stood there together and watched what unfolded. Jules, who had the natural authority of someone who runs a crew for a living, had positioned herself near the front steps. She addressed Gorman's parents directly. "Mr. and Mrs." "I'm sorry, I don't know your last name, Fitch," Gorman's mother said faintly. "Mr. and Mrs. Fitch, I want to make sure you have the full picture of what your son was asking. That workshop behind this house. I learned to use every tool in it when I was 15 years old. I didn't have a lot of places to be back then. This house was one of them. I run a construction business now. 11 employees. I learned the fundamentals right here." She paused. "Your son told Mr. Briggs this property was underused." Mrs. Fitch closed her eyes briefly. Prescott came forward. He had on a Purdue faculty sweatshirt, and he looked tired from his early flight, but his voice was clear. "I was 16 when I started coming here. I won't pretend I was easy to deal with. I wasn't. Mr. Briggs let me come back anyway, every Saturday, until I figured out that making something with your hands is the closest thing to thinking clearly that I've ever found." He looked at Gorman. "I study marine ecosystems now. I've published peer-reviewed papers. The discipline I learned in that shop is part of how I do my work. You were going to put a shuffleboard court where the router table is." There was a quiet sound from the crowd that wasn't quite a laugh, but was something adjacent to it. Gorman's jaw had tightened. I wasn't trying to just... It was practical. "My parents need a place. We have a place," his father said, unexpectedly. Everyone looked at him. He was still standing near the sedan with his hands in his pockets, but he had straightened up somehow. "We have an apartment," he said quietly. "It's a fine apartment. Gorman said we should move here. We said we'd look at it." He looked at his wife. "I don't think we were told the full picture either." Gorman started to say something. His father looked at him, and he stopped. Nessa took a small step closer to me on the porch. I didn't say anything. Neither did she. There are moments in a life where the people you love reveal themselves to you in a single clear gesture, and you want to give them room for it. This was one of those moments. Dorothea, who had driven 6 hours from Pittsburgh, and who I had always suspected was the most quietly determined person to ever come through my shop, stepped up to the porch. She had a roll of paper tucked under her arm. She handed it to me. "I drew this on the drive," she said. "Couldn't sleep." I unrolled it. It was a sketch of the workshop, detailed, done in pencil on drafting paper. She had rendered it from memory with the accuracy of someone who had spent real time in that space. Every bench. The window where the light came in right for detail work. The old radio on the shelf that had been playing the same country station since 1998. Even the board on the back wall where I'd written, in permanent marker, the first rule of the shop: measure twice. "I was 14 when I first saw that sign," she said. "I've thought about it almost every day since." I had to look at the creek for a moment. Gorman was quiet now. The assembled people in the yard weren't loud, weren't theatrical. There was no confrontation, no shouting. It was simply the presence of 61 lives. Well, 30-some of the 61, the ones who could make it on short notice, and the weight of what they represented. Gorman had walked into my house and seen an old widower with a truck and a workshop. He had not seen what that workshop had made. A man named Clifton, who worked in urban planning in Indianapolis, and who I remembered at age 12 as a boy who cried the first time a piece of wood split wrong, and then immediately figured out what he'd done and fixed it. Clifton spoke up from near the workshop door. "I used to come here after school when my dad was in the hospital," he said, "not to Gorman in particular, just to the air. I needed somewhere to go, where the problem in front of me was something I could solve. This place was that." He looked at Gorman. "You were going to put your parents' television in the room where Mr. Briggs stores his lumber. Did you know there are pieces in there that have been drying since 2006? You can't replace 18-year-old white oak. It doesn't exist. You just wait for it." There was a long silence. Gorman's mother walked up to me. She was a small woman, and she had the look of someone who wanted to say something but wasn't sure it would be adequate. "I didn't know about any of this," she said. "I saw a photograph of the house. Gorman said he said you were ready to downsize, that you'd been talking about it." "I had not been talking about it," I said. She nodded slowly. "I see that now." She looked out at the people in the yard, at Jules and Theron and Prescott and Dorothea and the others. "I'm sorry, genuinely. We should not have entertained this." I believed her. Gorman had gone quiet in the way that people go quiet when they are doing math in their heads and the numbers keep coming out wrong. He looked at the people in the yard. He looked at the workshop. He looked at Nessa, who was still standing next to me on the porch. She met his eyes, and she didn't look angry. She looked sad, which I think was worse for him. "I was trying to be practical," he said, to no one in particular, or maybe to himself. Theron, who had stayed close and whose patience I had always admired, said there's a version of practical that includes asking. You skipped that step. That was all. No speeches, no ultimatums. Just that. Gorman's father walked up to the porch steps. He looked up at me. "We won't be moving in," he said. "That's not. This isn't how we want to come into a family." He looked briefly at his son, or into a community. I nodded. "I appreciate that." He turned and walked back to their car, and after a moment his wife followed. She paused at the car door and looked back at the workshop, and then at the people in the yard one more time. I watched her connect the dots again, slowly, what that building was and what it had made. Then she got in. They drove away first. Gorman stood in the driveway alone for a moment. The people in my yard weren't looking at him anymore. They'd started talking to each other, catching up, the way people do when the immediate thing is resolved, and there is still a Saturday morning to spend together. Someone had brought a bag of pastries. Seamus was telling Clifton something about a dovetail jig he'd invented. Dorothea was showing Jules the sketch. Gorman walked to his car. He stopped at the door. He didn't look at me, but he looked at the workshop. "I didn't know," he said. "No," I agreed. "You didn't look." He got in the car. I looked at Nessa, who hadn't moved from the porch. "I'm sorry," she said, "that I didn't say something sooner." "You're saying something now," I said. She leaned her head against my shoulder for a moment. Then she straightened up and said she was going to get more coffee. Did anyone else want some, and went inside. The things that followed took several months to sort out. Some of them I expected. Some I didn't. Gorman and Nessa began marriage counseling about 3 weeks after that Thursday. Nessa had told him, quietly and without drama, that she could not be married to a person who treated her father as a problem to be managed, and that she needed to see whether he understood why. The counselor, I'm told, had her work cut out for her because Gorman's first instinct was to explain the logic of what he'd done rather than reckon with the effect. But Nessa is patient in the way that I hope I taught her to be, and she gave him the room to work through it, and I am cautiously willing to report that, as of this telling, they are still working. His parents sent me a card, a physical card, in an envelope with a stamp. Inside it, his mother had written, in the careful cursive of a woman who was taught penmanship, that she was sorry for the disruption, and that she hoped my garden did well this year. She had signed both their names. I put it on the refrigerator. Theron brought his nephew back to the Saturday workshop the following week. The boy had been coming for 2 months already, but that Saturday he seemed more settled, less like a visitor, and more like someone who was supposed to be there. At the end of the morning he held up a small box he'd made, simple, pine, maybe a little rough on the corners, and asked if he could come back next week. I told him the door was open. That evening I went out to the workshop alone, after the dog had been fed and the lights were coming on in the houses down the road. I stood at my bench and ran my hand along a piece of cherry I'd been saving for the right project. 18 years in the stack. It had the weight and smell of time itself. I didn't know yet what it wanted to be. I picked up a hand plane, took one pass down the edge of the board, just to feel it. The shaving curled up thin and clean, the way it does when everything is right. The blade, the angle, the grain. Measure twice, I thought. I set the plane down and turned off the light and went inside. If you're watching this, I'd like to know. What's something someone built for you? Not with lumber and tools, but with their time, that you've never forgotten. I think about that question more than people might expect. I think the answer tells you everything about what a person is actually worth.